The town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet place, nestled between dense woods and winding streams. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where secrets were whispered behind closed doors, and where the past lingered like a shadow. For Daniel Carter, moving to 123 Maple Street was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to escape the demons of his past and rebuild his life. Little did he know, the house he chose would become a prison of its own, harboring dark secrets that would unravel his sanity. Daniel had spent the last 3 years battling his addiction, a struggle that had cost him his marriage and the custody of his 2 children, Jake and Emily. His ex-wife, Lisa, had made it clear that if he could stay sober for 6 months, she would allow him to see the kids on weekends. That was all the motivation he needed. He had worked hard to get clean, attending countless meetings and therapy sessions, and now, with a new job lined up and a modest savings account, he felt ready to take on the world. The house itself wasn't much, old, run down, and in need of serious repairs. But it was big enough for him to dream of a future with his children. He envisioned fixing it up little by little, painting the walls a bright color, replacing the worn-out tiles, and even rebuilding the porch for summer barbecues. The backyard, with its overgrown grass and wildflowers, held the promise of laughter and joy. He imagined taking Jake fishing at the nearby stream, teaching him how to cast a line and reel in a catch. Moving in didn't take long. Daniel didn't own much, just a few pieces of furniture, some clothes, and the kitchen essentials Lisa had sent him after rehab. Within 2 days, he had everything set up and had even hung a few cheap paintings on the walls to make the place feel more like home. For the first time in a long while, he felt good, like he was actually getting his life together. He worked hard during the week, and by the time he got home, he was too exhausted to do anything but eat, watch old movies, and crash. But it felt right. He was making progress. The cravings were gone too. He hadn't wanted a drink in months, and since moving in, not once had the thought even crossed his mind. He was happy. Then about 2 months in, things started to change. Daniel had saved up some vacation time and decided to take a couple of weeks off to really get to work on the house. The repairs were going faster than expected. He had a little extra money left over, so he hired a local handyman named Kevin to help with the painting. Kevin was a friendly guy in his 30s, with a knack for fixing things and a contagious enthusiasm that made the work feel less like a chore. They worked side by side, laughing and sharing stories about their lives. Daniel felt a sense of camaraderie that he hadn't experienced in years. 3 nights later, the knocking started. Daniel had just sat down for dinner when he heard it, a light, rhythmic tap, tap. He froze, listening. Nothing. Thinking it might have been at the front door, he got up to check. But when he opened it, there was no one there. Shrugging it off, he closed the door and went back to his meal. He was just about to press play on a movie when he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, he could tell exactly where it was coming from. The hallway. Setting his fork down, he stood up and walked slowly toward the sound. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the kitchen behind him. He passed the basement door. Tap, tap, tap. He stopped cold. It was coming from the basement. A slow, deliberate knock. His heart started pounding. He took a step back, then another. Someone was in his house. He turned and grabbed his phone off the kitchen counter, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. A woman's voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I think someone's in my house, he whispered, gripping the handle of the kitchen knife he just used to cut his chicken. In the basement. What's your address, sir? 123 Maple Street, Willow Creek, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My name is Daniel Carter. Stay on the line. A unit has been dispatched. Are you able to leave the house? Tap, tap, tap. The knocking came again, slow, patient, like whoever was down there knew he was listening. Yes, he whispered. I'm heading to the door now. He backed toward the front door, moving as quietly as he could. His eyes never left the basement door. He could feel the darkness pressing against it, something waiting just beyond, just out of sight. Then, when he was only a few feet away from the door, tap, 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 he turned and ran. He threw the door open and jumped off the porch, landing hard on the pavement. Spinning around, he looked back at the house, his breath coming in fast, shallow gasps. The front door stood open behind him. The hallway beyond was dark, stretching into the house like a gaping mouth. The knocking had stopped. Sir? The 911 operator's voice crackled in his ear. "I'm outside," he managed. "I'm on the street. Stay there. Officers are en route. They should arrive any second." No sooner had she said it than he saw headlights rounding the corner. A squad car pulled up, its tires crunching against the gravel. Two officers stepped out, a young woman and an older man. "You the one who called?" the woman asked. He nodded, his mouth too dry to answer. Something moved in the house. He swallowed hard and pointed toward the basement door. "There's someone inside." The female officer, Officer Hale, glanced at her partner, Sergeant Willis, a graying man with tired eyes. He nodded at her before turning to Daniel. "All right, Mr. Carter, stay put. We'll check it out." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline, his pulse hammering in his ears. The officers drew their weapons and stepped up onto the porch, moving with practiced caution. Officer Hale pushed the front door open wider with her boot, her flashlight cutting through the darkness of the hallway. Her partner, Sergeant Willis, followed close behind. Daniel stood frozen on the street, staring at the open doorway. The house looked different somehow, wrong, like the shadows inside were too deep, stretching too far back into the halls. They disappeared inside. A tense silence followed. Then, creak! The basement door. He saw it shift from where he stood, just slightly, like someone had pressed against it from the other side. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but before he could, Sergeant Willis called out, "Police! If anyone's down there, come out now!" No answer. Officer Hale approached the basement door and tested the handle. Unlocked. Slowly, she pulled it open. A long, deep stairwell descended into pitch-black nothingness. She aimed her flashlight down. "I'll check it out," she said, stepping cautiously onto the stairs. Sergeant Willis stayed by the door, watching her descend. She only made it a few steps before stopping. Her flashlight flickered. "Willis, do you hear that?" she asked. Daniel held his breath, listening. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. It echoed up from the basement. Slow, hollow, waiting. Something in his gut twisted. Officer Hale hesitated, then stepped down further. The light from her flashlight flickered again. Then, a scream. Not hers. Something else. Something deep, shrill, and wrong. It came from inside the basement. Then her flashlight died. Complete darkness swallowed her whole. "Shit! Hale, get back up here!" Sergeant Willis shouted, stepping toward the doorway. A second later, Hale scrambled up the stairs, nearly falling in her rush. She shoved past Willis and slammed the basement door shut, her breathing ragged. "What the hell was that?" Willis demanded. "I don't know," she gasped. I thought I saw something move down there. And then the sound. God, that sound." Daniel gripped his arms, his skin cold despite the warm night air. Willis turned to him. "You're sure you were home alone?" "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hale exhaled, rubbing her face. "Jesus, I'm not going back down there without backup." Willis nodded. "Agreed, we'll call it in." He turned back to Daniel. "You got somewhere else you can stay tonight?" Daniel hesitated. "Yeah, a motel, I guess." Hale nodded. "Good. Don't come back here alone. Not until we check it out properly." He didn't argue. He didn't want to be anywhere near that house. He packed a small bag and left that night. The police searched the basement the next day. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had ever been down there. And yet, they never stayed long. Even during the day, the officers seemed uneasy, like they could feel something watching them from the shadows. They left by noon. That night, he got a call from Officer Hale. "Mr. Carter," she hesitated, her voice low. "If you hear the knocking again, don't open the door." Then she hung up. He didn't go back right away. Even after the cops left, even after they assured him there was nothing unusual in his house, he knew they were wrong. He had seen Officer Hale's face when she ran up those basement stairs. He had heard the sound, that awful shrill scream that no human should be able to make. There was something in that house, and he didn't want to be anywhere near it. He stayed in a motel on the other side of town for 3 days. He told himself he was just being cautious, that he needed time to cool off. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was terrified. The house had been his fresh start, his second chance. But now it felt like a trap, a thing waiting with bated breath for him to step back inside. Still, he couldn't avoid it forever. He had nowhere else to go. So, on the 4th day, he went back. The house felt different the second he stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick like walking through water. The silence wasn't empty. It felt full, like the house was listening, waiting. He locked the door behind him and took a slow breath. Nothing had changed. His furniture was still there, his things untouched. It was just a house. Just a house. He repeated that to himself as he moved through the rooms, checking every corner, every closet, every door. Eventually, he found himself standing outside the basement door. It was shut. He reached out, hesitating. Then he grabbed the knob and twisted. Locked. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Good. Maybe the police had locked it when they left. Maybe it was just a normal old house with a few creaky doors and bad wiring. Maybe. That night he went to bed, exhausted from stress and lack of sleep. He told himself everything was fine. Then, around 2 a.m., he woke up. At first, he wasn't sure why. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Then he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A chill ran down his spine, slow, rhythmic knocking. He turned his head toward the sound, his heart hammering. It was coming from the hallway, from the basement door. He sat up, his pulse pounding in his ears. He tried to tell himself it was just the house settling, just his imagination. But then he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. His breath hitched. He forced himself to move. Slowly, he slipped out of bed, his bare feet silent against the floor. He crept to the bedroom door and pressed his ear against it. Silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. He nearly stopped breathing. It was closer, right outside his bedroom door. He clenched his fists, every instinct screaming at him to stay still, to not make a sound. Then, the whispering started. It was faint, almost too soft to hear. A child's voice, sing-song and sweet. Come and play, come and play. Come and play with me. He swallowed a cry, backing away from the door. The voice giggled. Then, tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't the soft, rhythmic knock from before. It was harder, louder, like something was pounding on the wood, like something was trying to get in. He scrambled backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His eyes darted to the window. Could he climb out? Run? But then, silence. No knocking, no whispering, nothing. The house was still again. He waited, heart hammering. Minutes passed. Then, a soft click. The sound of a door unlocking. He felt his stomach drop. The basement door. Slowly he stepped forward, just enough to crack the bedroom door open. He peeked out. The hallway was empty, but the basement door? It was open. Not much, just an inch or two, but enough to see the blackness beyond, and enough for someone to be watching him from the darkness. He slammed his door shut and locked it. Then he pressed his back against the wall and slid to the floor, his entire body trembling. For the rest of the night, he stayed awake, listening to the sound of small, bare feet padding softly against the floor. Back and forth, waiting. He didn't remember falling asleep. All he knew was that when he opened his eyes, the sun was up. The golden light of morning spilled through his window, chasing away the shadows that had tormented him through the night. For a brief, wonderful second, he thought he had imagined everything. Then he saw the door, his bedroom door. The lock was still latched, but something had scratched the wood around the handle, thin, shallow marks, like fingernails dragging across it. He felt a sickening weight settle in his stomach. This was real. Something had been outside his door. He ran. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, and he didn't look back. He jumped into his car and drove, hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get out. He ended up at a diner on the other side of town. He ordered coffee, but he didn't drink it. He just sat there, staring at his hands, trying to stop them from shaking. At some point, his phone rang. He nearly jumped out of his seat. He checked the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he answered. Hello? Silence. Then the whispering started. Soft, sing-song, like a child giggling through the speaker. Come and play. Come and play. Come and play with me. He slammed the phone down on the table, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His pulse pounded in his ears. No, no, no. He was miles away from the house. How was this thing still? The phone rang again. His hands shook as he reached for it. He knew he shouldn't answer. He knew nothing good would come from this. But he pressed accept anyway. This time, there was no whispering. Just breathing. Shallow, ragged, wet. Like something was just on the other side of the line, waiting. Then, in a low, distorted voice, it spoke. You left the door open. He felt the blood drain from his face. The call ended. He stared at his phone, his entire body numb. Then, with a slow, sinking horror, he realized what it meant. The basement door. He had left it wide open. He didn't go back. He couldn't. He checked into a motel that night, locking the door and wedging a chair under the handle. He left the TV on for background noise, trying to convince himself that he was safe. He barely slept. By the next morning, he had made up his mind. He was done. He didn't care how much money he had sunk into that house. He didn't care if it was his last chance. He was never stepping foot in that place again. He called a realtor, told her he needed to sell immediately, that he didn't care about the price. She asked why. He told her the house was haunted. She laughed. He didn't. 3 days later, he met her at the property so she could take pictures for the listing. The house looked the same as ever, quiet, empty, untouched. Then, as they walked toward the front porch, she hesitated. "You said you weren't living here anymore, right?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I left last week." "Why?" She pointed to the second floor window. There, behind the glass, was a small, shadowy figure. A child. Watching them. Smiling. The realtor's face paled. "There's someone inside," she whispered. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even breathe. He just stared at the window, at the thing watching them. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, smiling. Then it waved. A slow, deliberate wave. Like it knew him. Like it was waiting for him to come back. He felt something inside him snap. "No," he said, stepping back. "We're leaving." The realtor hesitated. "But now." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she didn't argue. She turned and followed him back to the car, hat glancing over her shoulder as they went. He didn't look back. That night, he got another call. Same unknown number. He didn't answer, but then his voicemail pinged. Shaking, he pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, a voice. A child's voice. The message ended. He dropped his phone. He had never felt terror like that before. Pure, paralyzing fear. This wasn't just a haunted house. This thing, whatever it was, knew him. It could reach him, even miles away. He had to end this. The next day, he drove back to the house. Not to stay, to burn it down. He wasn't thinking straight. He didn't care if it was illegal. He just knew one thing. He had to destroy it before it destroyed him. He parked down the street and walked up the driveway, gripping the gas canister in his hands. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Then he stepped onto the porch, and the front door swung open by itself. The house was welcoming him back. The air was cold, heavy. The silence pressed against his ears like a physical weight. He stepped inside. The door shut behind him. The house felt wrong. Like it wasn't just an empty building anymore. Like it was alive. He took slow, measured steps toward the basement door. It was open. Of course it was. The darkness inside seemed deeper than ever. It stretched down and down, endless and hungry. Then tap, tap, tap. He gripped the gas canister tighter. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was furious. "You want me?" he growled. "Fine." He walked into the basement. The air turned freezing. With each step down, he could feel something waiting. The walls seemed to close in. The stairs felt longer than before, stretching downward for too long. Then, he reached the bottom. It was pitch black. He turned on his flashlight, and he saw them. Dozens of tiny footprints covering the dirt floor, leading in circles, leading toward him. Then he heard it, the giggling, right behind him. He spun around, and there it was, a small shadowy figure, a child, smiling up at him with empty black eyes. He opened his mouth to scream, but then it spoke. "I found you." And the light went out. The flashlight flickered, then died completely. Darkness swallowed him whole. He couldn't see, he couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. The air around him was thick, suffocating, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. The silence stretched on for what felt like eternity. Then a whisper, right against his ear. "Stay." He ran. Blind, desperate, he bolted for where he thought the stairs were. His hands scrambled against the walls, fingers scraping rough wood. He could hear footsteps behind him, small, bare feet chasing him. Then, a hand grabbed his ankle. He tripped, slamming hard onto the ground. Dirt filled his mouth. His pulse thundered in his ears. He kicked wildly, trying to break free. The grip tightened. He could feel fingers curling around his leg, small but impossibly strong. They were cold, too cold, like they had never felt warmth before. He thrashed, gasping for air. Then he saw them, shapes in the dark. Not just one, dozens. Small figures, their bodies blending into the shadows. Their eyes were empty, hollow pits of blackness. their smiles stretched too wide. They stood in a circle around him, watching, waiting. Then, in perfect unison, they whispered, "Come and play." He didn't remember how he got out. He only remembered the pain, the burning sensation in his chest as he ran, the way his fingers tore at the walls as he clawed his way up the stairs. Somehow, he made it to the top. Somehow, he reached the front door. He didn't stop running until he was in his car, tires screeching as he sped away, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep hold of the wheel. He didn't look back. He never went back to that house. He sold it for dirt cheap, didn't even care about the money. The new owner didn't ask many questions. Maybe he could feel it too, that wrongness seeping out from within the walls. A month later, he saw a news article. Local man disappears in mysterious circumstances. The new owner, gone without a trace. They found his car in the driveway, his front door wide open, but he was nowhere to be seen. The only thing left behind was a message, scrawled onto the basement wall in shaky, desperate handwriting. Don't play with them. 7 months have passed since that day. I sit here in this sterile room, the walls painted a dull white, the air thick with antiseptic. Tomorrow, they will take me to the attitude adjustment room. I know I won't remember any of this after that, so I'm writing it down, so that someone, anyone, will know the truth. I don't care if you believe me. Just promise me one thing. If you ever hear a soft tapping in the night, if you ever hear a child whisper, "Come and play," don't answer. Don't ever answer.